Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. We know how many sessions are happening at this conference, and the fact that you're here with us means a lot. Before we dive in, we want to introduce ourselves. I'm Alex Andrews, co founder of Swap Behind Bars. I've worked in the sex trade for over 40 years, and I've survived trafficking, incarceration, and more systems than I can count. I'm also a longtime national advocate for sex worker rights and justice for criminalized survivors. We also have with us Melanie Dante, MSW and Senior Case Manager at Swap Behind Bars. Melanie is a harm reductionist, social worker, and frontline support provider. Her work centers on meeting people where they are without judgment. And today, we are excited to have Dr. Tracy King, a nurse practitioner and public health advocate working toward trauma-informed, equitable care for criminalized and marginalized people. She is currently interning with SWAP BB and focused on improving health access for people in carceral and post-carceral spaces. We want to begin today with clarity because we know who's in the room, and we know some of you come with your pens already poised to write rebuttals before the first slide even loads. So before you do, we invite you to do something radical. Set down your pen. Suspend judgment. Use the most underutilized skill in the anti-trafficking advocacy space: listening. Swap Behind Bars is an anti-trafficking organization. Let us say that again. We are an anti-trafficking organization. We are not the pimp lobby, and we are not confused about the harm that exploitation causes. But we are also not confused about the harm caused by criminalization, stigma, and rescue-based policies, especially when those policies target the very people they claim to protect. We are led by people with lived experience: sex workers, trafficking survivors, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals, and people who've been locked out of every safety net system and still found a way to survive. Our work doesn't fit neatly into carceral frameworks or headlines. It exists in the complicated, often invisible space between victim and criminal. And that's not just a theoretical gap. It's where the majority of people we serve actually live. We call that space the Viminal Space. And today, we're inviting you to step into it with us, not to agree with everything we say, but to listen, because that's where real justice begins. You might be wondering what the Viminal Space actually is. The term viminal originates from the Latin word vimen, meaning a bendable twig, a symbol of flexibility, of something in between, not quite fixed, not quite broken. In ancient Rome, the Viminal was the smallest of the 7 hills, often overlooked and least fortified, yet it held symbolic value as a transitional space, neither center nor periphery. Today, we use the term the Viminal Space to describe a very different kind of terrain, the fraught, murky ground between criminalization and victimhood, between survival and systemic neglect. It is a space where exploitation, agency, trauma, and structural violence coexist, often in contradiction and almost always unacknowledged by our institutions. The viminal space is where the neat categories of our social services and criminal justice systems fall apart. It's the blurry boundary between victim and offender, between someone in need of help and someone labeled a threat. It is the front line of criminalized survival, where people who live through violence or coercion are still treated as suspects if they don't perform victimhood in a way that's legible to systems. It's where a person may be too criminalized to qualify for victim services, yet too traumatized and marginalized to find safety in the broader community. In this space, people are surviving by any means necessary, but are punished not for what happened to them, but for how they coped with it. And this isn't a theoretical concept. The viminal space shows up in policy and practice every single day. It's the arrest of a sex worker who tries to report an assault, only to be jailed because she has prior charges. It's the denial of housing to a trafficking survivor because she was forced to plead guilty under coercion. It's the harm reduction worker being surveilled as a potential co-conspirator instead of being recognized as a peer advocate. It's the intake form that asks the wrong questions, and the healthcare system that withholds care unless compliance is guaranteed. The viminal space is where harm is compounded by systems designed without nuance, systems that fail to recognize that survival itself is not a crime. This is the space we are asking you to enter with us, not to fix, but to understand. Because it is only by sitting in this space, acknowledging its complexity, and refusing to look away that we can begin to shift the conditions that make it necessary in the first place. The viminal space is uncomfortable, but it is also where the most urgent interventions are needed, and it's where the most powerful change can begin. Here are some real-life examples of how the viminal space impacts the lives of the people it comes in contact with. A 19-year-old trafficking survivor is arrested during a law enforcement sting meant to rescue her and others from exploitation. In the press release, she's described as a victim of trafficking, but in practice, she is charged with prostitution, drug possession, and obstruction. Despite being exploited, she is now burdened with a criminal record that bars her from housing, education, and employment opportunities. She is re-traumatized by the very system that claims to be protecting her. Worse, because of the charges, she becomes ineligible for victim compensation or support services. This is a textbook example of conflation, where all involvement in the sex trade is treated as trafficking, and survivors are criminalized unless they conform to a rigid, palatable narrative of victimhood. In another example, a hospital screens a visibly distressed woman for trafficking. She has untreated infections and shares that she's engaged in sex work, but when she refuses to involve law enforcement or enter a state-mandated exit program, she is labeled non-compliant and denied follow-up care. Her consent is disregarded, and her right to health is made conditional on cooperation with systems she may not trust. When care becomes a reward for submission rather than a basic human right, the most marginalized patients are pushed further into the margins. In the viminal space, a person who survives exploitation by asserting autonomy is punished for not being helpless enough. Consider the case of a mother who was trafficked by an intimate partner and later convicted for aiding and abetting his criminal activity. After serving time, she attempts to reunite with her children, only to find that the very conviction tied to her exploitation is now used to argue she's an unfit parent. Her identity as a survivor is erased by her criminal record. She's caught in a no-win scenario, penalized for staying and punished for surviving. This illustrates how the viminal space is not just personal, it's generational. Criminalization harms not only individuals, but their children and families, perpetuating cycles of trauma and separation. In the harm reduction space, stigma adds yet another layer. Some programs quietly deny services to people they perceive as prostituting for drugs, deeming them unworthy of support. Life-saving tools like clean syringes or overdose reversal meds become selectively distributed based not on need, but on perceived moral worth. Harm reduction, when it becomes conditional, is no longer harm reduction, it's moral triage. The viminal space is where survival strategies are misread as deviance, and people are deemed undeserving because they don't conform to sanitized narratives of redemption. Finally, we see the dangers of criminalizing community care. A peer outreach worker with a past trafficking conviction supports other sex workers by helping them access safe housing or screen dangerous clients. Instead of being recognized as a frontline service provider, she's arrested for promoting prostitution. Her leadership is punished. Her experience is weaponized against her. This reflects a systemic misunderstanding of peer support, where survivor-led solutions are framed as criminal conspiracies. In the viminal space, even helping someone else survive becomes a prosecutable act. This is why the viminal space matters. It's not just a metaphor, it's where real people are trapped between systems that call them victims and treat them like criminals. These contradictions are not accidents, they are structural. When institutions can't or won't differentiate between consent and coercion, survival and criminality, they deny people access to justice, care, and dignity. In this space, resources are withheld, harm is multiplied, survivors are erased, and entire communities are made more vulnerable. And the worst part? It's all by design. To understand how criminalization impacts people in the sex trade across the globe, it's essential to examine the four dominant legal models that govern sex work and survival economies. Each model reflects a different set of values, power structures, and assumptions about consent, labor, and public safety, and each has dramatically different outcomes for the people affected. Full criminalization is the most punitive model in which every participant, sex workers, clients, third parties, and anyone offering support, is criminalized. This is the model in place in countries like Russia, most of the United States, and South Africa. In these settings, sex workers are often subject to constant surveillance, police harassment, and incarceration. Criminal records follow them for life, creating long-term barriers to housing, healthcare, and employment. In the US, for example, Black and trans sex workers are disproportionately targeted, with police stings often framed as anti-trafficking operations, even when no coercion is present. Rather than reducing exploitation, full criminalization pushes sex work further underground, where violence and abuse become harder to report, and survival strategies are treated as criminal conspiracies. Partial criminalization appears more moderate on the surface, but still creates conditions ripe for harm. Under this model, the act of selling sex might be legal, but everything around it, like brothel keeping, working with others, advertising, or hiring security, is criminalized. This model is used in the United Kingdom and Ireland, where sex workers are technically allowed to operate but can be prosecuted for keeping a disorderly house or simply sharing a workspace for safety. In practice, this isolates workers and forces them into dangerous situations to avoid arrest. The law encourages solo work, which increases vulnerability to violence and discourages calling the police out of fear that one's workspace or colleagues will be criminalized. While portrayed as middle ground, partial criminalization maintains the same structural harms while offering none of the safety promised by legality. The Nordic model, also called the equality model, criminalizes the purchase of sex but not the selling of it. This approach originated in Sweden and has since been adopted in countries like Norway, Canada, France, and Ireland. Proponents claim it targets exploiters and supports workers, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. Because clients fear arrest, transactions are rushed, screenings are shortened, and workers are forced into more hidden or isolated environments to maintain business. Outreach workers in Sweden have reported that sex workers under the Nordic model still face eviction, surveillance, and stigma. Landlords are pressured to remove tenants suspected of selling sex, and police often treat sex workers as informants rather than as people entitled to safety. In Canada, which adopted this model in 2014, sex workers report no meaningful improvements to safety or justice access. The Nordic model is often sold as decriminalization light, but in practice, it preserves all the dangers of criminalization while dressing them in feminist language. In contrast, full decriminalization removes all criminal penalties for consensual adult sex work. This is the model implemented in New Zealand since 2003 and more recently in parts of Australia, such as New South Wales and the Northern Territory. In these regions, sex work is treated as labor, and workers are entitled to occupational health and safety protections. The result has been measurable. Sex workers in New Zealand report increased ability to refuse clients, greater access to legal protections, and improved relationships with law enforcement when crimes like assault or trafficking occur. Importantly, there is no evidence that decriminalization increases trafficking. In fact, studies show it improves the identification of coercion and gives survivors more avenues for support. Decriminalization doesn't mean deregulation. It means safety, autonomy, and dignity. When people talk about ending demand, what they often mean is increasing police surveillance, not ending exploitation. These models are not neutral. They are built on cultural values, power structures, and often colonial legacies that determine who is seen as worthy of protection and who is punished for surviving. Whether someone is labeled a victim, a criminal, or simply disposable depends less on their actual experience and more on the legal lens through which they are viewed. Conflation hurts everyone. The conflation of consensual sex work with human trafficking causes real and lasting harm, not just to individuals, but to entire communities. When we erase the distinction between people who engage in sex work for survival, agency, or income, and those who are coerced or exploited through trafficking, we not only misrepresent the reality of both groups, but we make every solution worse. Conflation multiplies harm by collapsing two very different experiences into one oversimplified narrative. It blurs the concept of consent entirely, treating all sex work as inherently violent and all sex workers as either victims in denial or criminals in disguise. This framing strips people of their autonomy, criminalizes their survival, and places them at greater risk of violence, surveillance, and stigma. When policy is shaped by this conflation, survivors are frequently misclassified. Those who may be in exploitative situations are denied access to services if they don't act like victims or refuse to cooperate with law enforcement. Meanwhile, sex workers who are not trafficked are swept up in stings, targeted by anti-trafficking raids, and incarcerated under the same frameworks that claim to protect them. Rather than offering safety, these efforts often increase vulnerability by pushing workers further underground, removing their income, separating them from children or housing, or exposing them to carceral trauma. Well-meaning policies that claim to protect women can end up hurting the very people they aim to save, especially when those women don't fit the savior narrative. Migrant sex workers, LGBTQ+ workers, people of color, and those with criminal records are disproportionately affected by this misclassification. They are more likely to be arrested, surveilled, or deported than they are to be offered genuine support. And once criminalized, their chances of accessing health care, housing, or safety networks dwindle even further. Conflation also diverts resources. Rather than investing in housing, harm reduction, and peer-led outreach that actually improves safety and reduces exploitation, governments and NGOs pour money into law enforcement strategies that break up communities, isolate workers, and create fear. Anti-trafficking funding becomes an extension of the criminal legal system instead of a tool for trauma recovery and survivor empowerment. When sex work is equated with trafficking, not only do we fail to protect those who are truly being trafficked, we also create new forms of harm for people who were never exploited to begin with. A young woman was brought into the United States as a minor under false pretenses. She was promised the chance to go to school and work in domestic labor, but instead found herself trafficked, first for household labor and eventually into the sex trade. For years, she lived under the control of exploiters, moving from city to city, undocumented and without access to any meaningful legal protection. Despite being a child when she was first coerced into these circumstances, she was never identified or treated as a trafficking victim. As she grew older and aged out of any child-specific protections, she continued to survive however she could, relying on informal networks and doing what was necessary to get by in a system that had already failed her. Years later, during a high-profile anti-trafficking sting in Florida, she was arrested alongside several others. The media praised the operation as a win against human trafficking, but on the ground, the experience was anything but liberating. She didn't speak English, and no translator was provided during her interrogation. No advocate explained her rights, her options, or the immigration consequences she might face. She was handed a plea deal and told that if she signed, she could avoid jail. If she refused, she might face far worse, including possible deportation. Scared and confused, she signed. That one signature became a conviction for prostitution and obstruction, charges that instantly disqualified her from most forms of immigration relief and survivor services. She lost her job, her housing, and custody of her children. Despite her clear history as a trafficking victim, she was never given the opportunity to apply for a T visa or any other protective status because she now had a criminal record. Worse, that same record was then used as evidence against her to deny her victimhood altogether, and she was ultimately deported back to Colombia, where she had no family or friends and faced insurmountable danger. Her case demonstrates just how narrow and conditional the concept of rescue can be when filtered through a carceral lens. Instead of being offered protection, she was punished. Instead of receiving support, she was further destabilized. Her trauma was ignored because she didn't fit the state's mold of the perfect victim: passive, white, English-speaking, and compliant. The harm was compounded by her immigration status, her criminal charges, and the lack of cultural and linguistic support. This story is not unusual. It reflects what happens when systems prioritize arrests and optics over outcomes and justice. It shows the cost of conflating trafficking with all forms of sex work and treating immigrant survivors as collateral damage in a performance of public safety. This wasn't rescue. This was incarceration dressed up as intervention, and it happens every day. When survival is criminalized, healthcare becomes collateral damage. People engaged in the sex trade, whether by choice, circumstance, or coercion, often experience serious health needs that go unmet, not because the care doesn't exist, but because access to it is blocked by fear, stigma, and surveillance. Trauma is routinely ignored or misdiagnosed. Providers may overlook or minimize symptoms because of biases about drug use, mental illness, or sex work. This leads to serious conditions going untreated and re-traumatization happening inside the very institutions meant to offer healing. HIV prevention efforts are also severely undermined. Criminalization discourages people from accessing condoms, PrEP, or regular testing out of fear that these tools could be used as evidence in legal proceedings. In many jurisdictions, even possessing multiple condoms has been used as proof of intent to engage in prostitution, which forces people to choose between safety and arrest. Reproductive health care is often inaccessible or conditional. People who have been trafficked or who work in criminalized economies frequently lack control over contraception, are denied abortion access, or are mistreated during pregnancy. Those with children face an added layer of risk. Seeking care can trigger child welfare investigations or mandatory reporting that leads to separation instead of support. Reproductive justice is impossible in a system where your body is policed before it's ever cared for. Mental health is also weaponized. Instead of being offered support, many people navigating trauma, PTSD, substance use, or anxiety are punished for their symptoms. Incarceration is used as a stand-in for care, and disorderly conduct becomes the charge attached to an untreated mental health crisis. This criminalization of mental health issues compounds harm and creates cycles of hospitalization, arrest, and institutional abandonment. All of this leads to one devastating outcome: people stop seeking help altogether. When accessing healthcare means risking arrest, losing your children, being misgendered or humiliated, or being reported to immigration authorities, many decide it's safer to stay in the shadows. For sex workers and survivors, healthcare systems become another site of control, not care. Until we end the criminalization of survival, we cannot claim to offer trauma-informed care, reproductive justice, or public health. The harm isn't accidental, it's structural. Reentry barriers are real, and they don't start at the prison gate. They begin long before someone is released, often while they're still entangled in crisis, exploitation, or the carceral system itself. True reentry begins the moment we choose to treat someone with dignity, regardless of their legal status, trauma history, or survival choices. But in reality, most people emerging from incarceration or criminalization face a reentry process riddled with structural roadblocks that have little to do with rehabilitation and everything to do with systemic exclusion. One of the most immediate and devastating barriers is discrimination in housing and employment. A criminal record, even for survival-based offenses like prostitution or drug possession, can disqualify someone from public housing, private rentals, or transitional shelters. Employers routinely reject applicants based on background checks, regardless of their qualifications or the nature of the charges. People trying to rebuild their lives are told no before they've even had a chance to explain. Add to that the lack of access to basic documents and transportation. Many individuals leave incarceration without valid ID, birth certificates, or social security cards. These are prerequisites for nearly every aspect of civilian life, from applying for jobs to accessing health care, opening a bank account, or enrolling children in school. Without a way to get to appointments or interviews, even the best reentry programs become inaccessible. These aren't personal failings. They are logistical dead ends that reflect how poorly we prepare people for success. Healthcare access is another major hurdle. Physical and mental health needs often go untreated while someone is incarcerated, and upon release, finding trauma-informed care becomes nearly impossible, especially for people who are uninsured or navigating Medicaid red tape. Survivors of trafficking or exploitation may carry significant complex trauma, but few providers are equipped to offer judgment-free, culturally competent care that doesn't require a diagnosis or a declaration of victimhood to begin. Perhaps most insidious is the stigma that shows up in every intake form, interview, and institutional interaction. People are asked to prove they're deserving of help, to declare themselves clean or reformed, to demonstrate compliance before receiving basic services. This shame-first approach creates psychological barriers that are just as real as the bureaucratic ones. It tells people, you brought this on yourself, and you have to earn your way back into humanity. This isn't about poor choices, it's about poor options. It's about a system that sets people up to fail and then blames them for falling. Re-entry, if we take it seriously, must be about removing barriers, not adding more hoops to jump through. It must recognize that survival is not a crime, and that healing doesn't happen on a countdown clock. Until then, re-entry remains just another extension of the punishment cycle, dressed up in the language of support. So what can you actually do right now in your role, in your organization, in your community? You can start by believing people. That might sound simple, but it's a radical act in systems that constantly demand proof of suffering. When someone tells you their sex work was consensual, or that it was a survival strategy, or that they don't want to engage with law enforcement, believe them. Don't assume coercion where there is none, and don't require people to collapse under the weight of their trauma in order to be seen as worthy of support. You can offer services without strings. That means creating pathways to safety and support that don't require compliance, confession, or cooperation with the criminal legal system. No more mandatory reporting to law enforcement for people seeking help. No more gatekeeping support based on how victim-like someone appears. If your program can't offer help without policing people's autonomy, it's not really a trauma-informed program. It's a surveillance checkpoint. Decriminalize in practice, not just in theory. Don't require moral declarations or public repentance as the price of care. Make your services accessible to people at all stages of survival. Shift your language, revise your forms, question the assumptions baked into your policies, and most importantly, document institutional harm. When clients are denied services, mistreated, or re-traumatized by the system, write it down. Those stories, those patterns, become the evidence we need to push for real change. Push for policy change internally. Whether you work in a hospital, a nonprofit, a shelter, a courtroom, or a classroom, your institution has policies that can be challenged, rewritten, or scrapped altogether. You don't need a state legislature to make change. You need a staff meeting, a commitment to equity, and a refusal to look away. One of the most critical reforms we can implement today is immunity. Survivors must be able to report violence, exploitation, or harm without fear of arrest, retaliation, or deportation. We need prosecutorial immunity for people engaged in the sex trade, survivor-centered policies that don't rely on criminal prosecution, and safety protocols that don't require people to snitch in order to be protected. Safety should never be a reward for cooperation. It should be a fundamental right. And the truth is, decriminalization works. The data is clear and consistent across studies and regions. Where sex work is decriminalized, violence against workers decreases, health outcomes improve, access to justice increases, trust between providers and communities grows. Cycles of poverty and incarceration are disrupted. Decriminalization doesn't mean the absence of structure. It means the presence of choice, consent, and basic human rights. This isn't a radical demand. It's an evidence-based, life-saving intervention. Criminalization doesn't just hurt individuals. It harms families, generations, entire communities. We've seen children taken away because their mother was labeled a risk simply for surviving through sex work. We've seen the trauma of arrest, incarceration, and family separation passed from parent to child like an inheritance. When we criminalize survival, we create a legacy of punishment that outlives any single sentence. Decriminalization is not just a policy shift. It's a generational intervention. And you don't have to be a lawmaker to make this happen. You can be an implementer. You can bring trauma-informed practices into your daily work. You can fund and uplift survivor-led organizations that are already doing the work, often without the resources they deserve. You can revise your intake forms, train your staff with nuance and humility, and advocate louder when others stay silent. Every decision you make, every policy you shape, every relationship you build, it all matters. You're either reinforcing the system or resisting it. The Viminal Space isn't just a theoretical concept. It's a living, breathing reality for millions of people navigating systems that fail to see their full humanity. It's the moment when a healthcare provider meets a patient with visible trauma and a complicated backstory. It's the social worker holding an intake form that doesn't have a box for survival. It's the policy writer, the grant manager, the outreach volunteer, the court advocate, the probation officer, the educator. All of us at some point are asked, whether explicitly or silently, will you see a criminal or a person? Will you perpetuate harm or disrupt it? Will you pathologize or will you listen? That is the Viminal Space, and it is a choice point. Reducing trafficking and exploitation on a global scale requires more than good intentions or punitive policies. It demands deep collaboration across movements, across experiences, and across ideologies. We cannot arrest our way to safety. We cannot rescue our way to dignity. And we will not end trafficking by turning away from the lived expertise of sex workers, survivors, migrants, and people on the margins. If we are serious about ending harm, we must be serious about ending criminalization, stigma, and structural neglect. This work is bigger than any one organization, framework, or political leaning. Whether you work in harm reduction, healthcare, law enforcement, education, immigration, or policy, there is room for you here, and responsibility too. It is time to set aside our silos, our assumptions, and our egos. It's time to choose collaboration over conflict, justice over judgment, and solutions over sound bites. Because the truth is, we don't have to agree on everything to work together toward liberation. But we do have to agree on one thing. No one should be punished for surviving. The work ahead is complex, but it is not impossible. And we're calling you in, not calling you out. Choose compassion. Choose justice. Choose not to look away. We'd love to open up for questions, reflections, challenges. Drop them in the chat or raise your hand. We are deeply grateful for the opportunity to be in dialogue, not just presentation mode. If you want to stay in touch, Alex at swapbehindbars.org, www.swapbehindbars.org.